Hello everybody. Today we're going to be doing a short video on Ramp Scurvox. Now this is a deck that I used to run like a year and a half ago. I brought it to the World Championships and it did really well. And since then it's gotten a little bit better with some new support, specifically with the wild allies. So a couple of, well, the update before this one brought in Call of the Wild, Slithering Viper, a bunch of wild allies that are very strong. And then recently, a new card has been released called Deepwood Tiger that has also buffed this wild strategy. So anyway, the purpose of this deck is to ramp resources really quickly, and so that's why we're running cards like Bounty Hunter that renews resources when you kill a poisoned ally. It got rejigged a little bit in its effect. And then we run another card that we haven't drawn yet that I'll cover, and we just draw it now. It's called Anmor's Call. This is the key card of the deck. When a friendly ally dies, it's placed on top of your resource pile, as long as it was 4 cost or less. So, just talking about the strategy of this deck, what you're going to try and do is on turn 4, play this card, Anmor's Call, and then basically, actually, what I like to do is essentially stop playing any cards for resources, stop sacrificing cards, and instead focus on basically summoning allies out and letting them die as your way of getting resources. So you'll see that that's what we kind of are doing here. We're not sacrificing. And I think that's a really important thing of the part of the deck that people don't necessarily appreciate, is that you don't have to sacrifice. So that's why I didn't sacrifice last turn, because all of these allies I have on the board right now are going to become resources. So I go Scurvox there just because my opponent has a bunch of allies out. I want to preserve my allies out and then go for a board wipe with Overwhelm. And so actually I first attach Bounty Hunter and then play the Deepwood Tiger there, because I can kill 2 poison allies to renew 5 resources, and then Overwhelm to clear the board essentially. So Overwhelm is another key part of this deck, because we focus on ally spam, and then it's just really helpful to have access to this card that normally you wouldn't run because it's so expensive, but in this deck we ramp so quickly that it's fine. So here, this is another part of this deck that is really cool. You can basically use Scurvox ability, disable all your opponent's allies, then your opponent's going to have a turn where they can't actually kill a lot of your allies, and then Overwhelm on the very next turn. So that's kind of what we're doing here, and well, our opponent is using some of their ability cards like Yari Marksman and the Hero Power of Boris to kill 2 of our allies. But that's actually kind of helpful because it's putting us on 9 resources. I do sacrifice a little bit there just because I do have the Bad Santa, so I do want to clear up some room for that. I go attack with Black Adder to poison the Yari Marksman. That's going to allow me to renew 3 resources when it dies, and then thus play Wrath of the Forest. So now we've got a pretty good setup here, where yeah, we have we're drawing 1 whenever an ally dies, and we're ramping 1 whenever an ally dies, and whenever we kill a poison ally, we renew 3 resources. So this lets you do some bonkers things. So we're going to play the Killer Bee there. It's going to become a resource and draw us a card. So basically ramp and everything, and 2 damage. So yeah, that's just kind of like an idea of what this deck is capable of. And now we just spam allies. I'm running Cage Savage there just because it's another body on the board that if it dies, great. And if it just sticks on the board, that's 1 more for Overwhelm. So yeah, that's basically what this deck does. And as you can see, we're on 12 resources and we haven't even been sacrificing every turn. So what I really like about this is we're very resistant to board clears, because if they clear our board, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 resources for it. For us. Not that our opponent is running board clears in a warrior deck, but still. So yeah, now here we can just actually just close out the game, because we have the Rampant Krygons to boost up the Cage Savage into a 6 attack body. So yeah, that is that game. Now, I do also want to show this video. This is another Boris, so normally I like showing off two videos against two different heroes, but this is a very different type of Boris. If you've seen my recent video on basically Rise of the Banners, this is a variant on that I actually quite like. So props to RS Attacking for coming up with some upgrades to that deck. But it's the same idea. You're playing support abilities and turning them into allies with Rise of the Banners. And I think it's quite an effective deck. So be on the lookout for that on Ranked. But as you can see, the idea is just playing a bunch of support abilities. There is Rain Delay, just making it so we can't attack. And also, I'm presuming that that's going to be transformed into an ally. So we'll see what attacking does here. Another Valiant Defender here. Another support ability, actually discarding a card to clear up the hand for a draw. And then, yeah, Rise of the Banners, turning all three into allies. And now they've got this very nice board of allies out. So what we're going to do is, sadly, we don't have the Anmor's Call. Luckily, we do draw into it here. This deck does have a large amount of draw, so we're usually pretty good on that front. But it's too bad we didn't get to play the Anmor's Call, because now these allies that are going to be killed aren't going to go to our resource stack. Our opponent's going to play Serenity now, and importantly, that's going to stop our poison damage. So that is a little bit annoying, but here we're just going to go ahead for the Bounty Hunter, renew 3 resources so that we can play Anmor's Call. Now we've got all the resource generation, both Bounty Hunter and Anmor's Call, so we'll be pretty good on resources. Now the question is solving our draw. So we're going to want to find some way to draw some cards. Luckily, one of the advantages... Oh, and then our opponent just plays Bad Santa, which helps us out a ton into getting the cards that we need here, in addition to the Bazaar. So now we can just get kind of greedy here, just play a bunch of stuff. That Killer Bee actually doesn't die because of the Serenity Now, which is pretty cool. And now we've just got plenty and plenty of draw. So that's really nice. This was a really useful snipe. So I should talk about Deepwood Tiger a little bit. When it's summoned, the top card of their deck enters play as a 0/2. And getting rid of one of those Rise of the Banners is huge against this deck, because this deck needs every single Rise of the Banners it has. So that's definitely a really very lucky snipe there. So then our opponent Rise of the Banners again. That's a lot of allies out. So now we have to start worrying about next turn. We're probably going to get overwhelmed. So basically what we're going to do before that is we're going to counter Overwhelm. So one of the downsides of this style deck is all your allies have 3 health. So we were able to clear it with Overwhelm. I think if Serenity Now was still out, that would have not been doable. But with Serenity Now out of the picture, Overwhelm can just defeat it then. Now, here are some of the things I do like about our attacking deck is the inclusion of Monk. That's pretty powerful. Just having that extra stall card, because this deck is all about getting bodies out, is really nice. And here I'm just spamming allies, but I can't attack with any of them because of Monk. So here I'm pretty susceptible to a Overwhelm. I wouldn't be surprised to see Overwhelm get dropped here. And so let's see what happens here. But I'm okay with an Overwhelm here because of the fact that essentially... Oh, okay, and so no Overwhelm, but all of our allies would become resources here, so it wouldn't be that bad. Now it looks like our opponent has set up with a bunch of support abilities, setting up for another Rise of the Banners probably, so we'll see how that goes. We're going to try and draw into Overwhelm, but we can always seek it with the thing here, the ability, and luckily we do draw into it, so we have Overwhelm on board. We're going to Overwhelm, and that is pretty good for us there. I held off on playing allies because I noticed that my deck is only 13 cards, and so I didn't want to, I fully expect an Overwhelm here. And yeah, Overwhelm is here. So I didn't play all my allies yet. I wanted to keep some allies around just in case. And now I can counter Overwhelm. So Call of the Wild here. We luckily draw into the Overwhelm, but we could always seek it with this location. And now our opponent is out of cards in their deck, so that just makes it really good for us. Anyway, yeah, I do want to highlight this here. 20 resources, that is pretty tough to do with any deck, even a dedicated ramp deck. So, yeah, it's pretty cool that this deck is capable of something like that. And yeah, now we can just reapply the board, Overwhelm again, and actually I think that's game. So yeah, a very deadly deck when it gets going. And so it's still a strong deck even now. I think it's definitely one to look into if you're looking for a competitive deck that does things a little bit differently. So overall, though, key card in the deck is Anmor's Call. So the main thing to know about this deck is on turn 4, you want to play this. Basically, no matter what. You could have lost the board. You could be, you would rather take hits to the face 9 times out of 10 and set up Anmor's Call than try and play allies on turn 4. Because if you can play this card on turn 4, that just makes the rest of your game way easier. And no matter what your opponent does, they're put in this tough spot where, maybe they want to kill your allies, but that's going to give you resources. And so maybe they don't want to kill your allies, they want to go face. But if they go face, then you have all these allies out and you can overwhelm them. So it puts your opponent in this impossible choice. Leave your allies out so that you can overwhelm them, or kill your allies and give you a ton of resources so you can just summon more allies. So that's the key idea of the deck. This combination between Anmor's Call and Overwhelm is really powerful. Now, the exceptions might be if you're against something like Jericho that can just blow up an attachment, that you might have to just play completely differently against, and some other matchups, but in general, you want to be playing Anmor's Call on turn 4. Now, obviously, we're running a 53-card deck. I do think this deck benefits from being a little thicker. I do like running 40-card decks for that consistency, but this deck is a little bit of an exception because we burn through cards so quickly. So that means you're not always going to be seeing Anmor's Call on turn 4. Luckily, Bounty Hunter is like a slightly worse Anmor's Call. It still achieves the same goal of renewing resources and letting you play a ton of allies out. It's just not going to benefit you when your allies die, which is gonna be, and it's also a little tricky to trigger, but with Scurvox's ability, your opponent's allies are gonna be poisoned anyway. We have so many ways to poison allies. So these 6 cards make up the bulk of our resource renewal. I would run more Bounty Hunter, but I think at that rate you're gonna brick. You're gonna see too many resource renewing cards, and you can't actually play all of them. Okay, anyway, that's the central piece of the deck. Now to go over the allies. 3 Cage Savage. I do really like Cage Savage in this deck because it's like, okay, yes, it has 0 attack, but the benefit of running Cage Savage is that if your opponent doesn't kill it, then you have that one extra ally out there that can be used to overwhelm the opponent. If I'm going second, I do like playing this on turn 1. If I'm going first, I often sacrifice this, unless I have Bad Santa in hand, in which case I will play this turn 1, then Bad Santa on turn 2. But anyway, essentially, the idea is you can play it early in some situations, and in some situations you do sacrifice it, because I think our early game is where we're the most prone. So that's why I'm only running 3. I don't think it's a card you always want to see. Obviously, a 0 attack is pretty meh, but on 6 health, that's really nice. The other thing about Cage Savage is it synergizes really well with Rampant Krygon. Next up is 4 Black Adders. This is a solid turn 2 play because even if, your opponent kills it with an ally, it's going to get poisoned. And so that's really helpful, especially since we're running Bounty Hunter. It's also a wild ally, which is the main reason why we're running this card. Because it's a wild ally, it synergizes really well with Call of the Wild. Killer Bee is another card that is excellent in this deck because it kills itself, which means that it instantly is going to be triggering your Anmor's Call. So you could think of this as a 1-cost deal 2 damage to an opponent ally and ramp. It's just a really good card in this deck. Plus it poisons, so it goes really well with our Bounty Hunter. Rampant Krygon is a really good card in this deck. So one thing to know about this deck is you actually want some of your allies to be dying so that you can be getting resources for them. And also when you play like Wrath of the Forest, you can draw for them dying. So your allies dying is no problem, and that's why it's okay to run something that's almost definitely going to die, like Rampant Krygon. It's definitely going to die. It has 1 health. But you get this 2 attack haste ally, so it's really good. So that's why I like it. That's why we're running 4 of these. Plus it synergizes with the Cage Savage, which is a little rarer, but comes up. Next, let's talk about one of the new cards in Rekindle Rebirth that is so strong, that has kind of flown under the radar, I feel. It's called Deepwood Tiger. When it's summoned, the top card of your opponent's deck enters play as a 0/2. Now, that could be tricky if your opponent is playing something like Alden the Brave, but the nice thing about running Deepwood Tiger with Scurvox is you can instantly poison and disable it, so you don't have to worry about that. Plus, actually, it enters play exhausted, so what ends up happening is even if your opponent has Alden the Brave, if you just play this out, it at least takes them one turn to unexhaust it at the end of their turn, and then attack with it essentially 2 turns later. So the downside is very minimal, and sometimes there's an upside when you counter in stuff like Bounty Hunter. Now, one thing to know is that it's a wild ally, so that it synergizes with the Call of the Wild. It's 3 cost, which is really solid because it gives this deck a really strong turn 3 play. And it's got basically some of the strongest stats. It's overstatted for a 3-cost ally. So most 3-cost allies are going to be 2 attack and 5 health. This is 3 attack and 5 health. So this is a very strong card, very, very good. And one thing I really like about it in this deck in particular is that essentially we are running more of a control deck. And so deck count does start to matter. There does come a point in the game where you're going to mill your opponent out potentially, and then maybe you need to win by milling the opponent out. And so Deepwood Tiger just helps us mill the opponent. And as you saw in one of the games that we showed in this video, we were able to snipe one of the Rise of the Banners. So you can sometimes snipe a key card with it. It's very solid. Falseblood Cultist is another great card for this deck. Essentially, we don't care that our allies are dying, and we do need card advantage. Drawing cards is super important, so running 4 of these is very good. For Slithering Viper, another wild count, and also disabling something for 1 turn is amazing. With Falseblood Cultist, this combo is really good. You discard it, disable something, and draw 2. Now, Slithering Viper gives us some very needed survivability. I think one of the issues with the ramp deck is like against something like, I don't know, even something like a Rush Mage, you're going to get rushed down too quickly. And so Slithering Viper helps even the scales a little bit, but I would say some aggressive decks can still punish this deck quite a lot. Next, we've got 4 Bad Santa. Drawing cards is really important in this deck, so I run 4 Bad Santas. I run Bad Santa over Hunter's Gambit because again, as a control deck, like, I think Bad Santa is okay because at some point your opponent's going to mill out, and then Bad Santa is not going to be as useful to them. And because we have such a strong resource advantage over the opponent, and I've talked about this in the Resource Destruction deck I recently posted too, with Resource Destruction Threbbin. When you have a resource advantage against the opponent, you don't care as much about them drawing cards because you have more resources. So the cards that you're drawing are better because you can play more of them than the opponent can. I think against a deck, if you're running a deck that, you know, you're going to be even on resources with the opponent, or like a resource destruction deck that that stays low on resources, then Bad Santa is a lot less good because you're giving your opponent cards, and your opponent can just play those cards. But especially in this deck, you have such a resource advantage. In one of the games we just saw, I had 20 resources. That Bad Santa is like, the downside is much more negligible. We already talked about these. A Call of the Wild is another great draw card. You draw 2 cards, and then it reduces the next 3 wild allies you summon this turn by 2 cost. So what I really like about this card is that it's draw, but it doesn't cost that many resources in total in the late game because you can just use those resources to summon wild allies. And so Call of the Wild is great because it's draw, but also it's like cheap draw because you're getting the cost reduction there. So another really great card for this deck, and actually you may have noticed that I'm not running one of the most popular cards in Hunter decks. I'm not running Hunter's Gambit. And so yeah, you can run Hunter's Gambit, but I would way rather run Call of the Wild because this deck is all about summoning out allies, and I don't really care about giving an opposing ally -2 health. Overwhelm is a key card in this deck. You just deal X damage to all opposing allies and heroes, equal to the number of allies you control. Now, when you have 20 resources and you're summoning, 5 allies per turn, Overwhelm becomes quite good. But we also have a bunch of other tricks, such as Transporting Golem. So Transporting Golem becomes an ally at the start of your next turn, so that adds to your Overwhelm count. The fact that we're running stuff like Cage Savage really helps out with Overwhelm, and just the general strategy of ramping resources. I'm only running one Augmenting Golem because I do find that I brick with it, but this is a very good card against mages, actually against a lot of decks, even weapon heroes. Just giving everything +1 health is so strong. I almost never use it for the Waken, I just use it for the +1 health to everything, unless I'm on an Overwhelm turn or a kill turn, because of the fact that it just makes it so much harder to clear our allies, and so it sets up Overwhelm super nicely. Okay, now this is one that I get a lot of feedback on. People are like, why are you only running 3 Wrath of the Forest? Your deck is all about killing allies. Well, one of the things about this deck that you should be aware about is the item count. Like, it's really hard to justify adding in any kind of support into this deck. I want to be running mostly allies in this deck, and that's because this deck is all about spamming allies and letting them die. And 4 Wrath of the Forest is less good than you think, because the 4th Wrath of the Forest, you know, like, you can only play 1 Wrath of the Forest. So you have 2 copies of Wrath of the Forest, it's bricking you. It's making it so that you're not drawing allies. So that's why I only run 3. And now you might be wondering, why doesn't the same logic apply to Anmor's Call? The reason is you always want to see Anmor's Call. I think Anmor's Call is just better than Wrath of the Forest because we have so many other ways to draw cards. I think like probably half the cards in this deck draw cards. So drawing cards is way less good than Anmor's Call, which gives you resources. And that's why I'm more than happy to run it on 3. It's a very good card, but again, you don't want to brick with it. Finally, I run 1 Soul Seeker. I'm kind of mixed on this. I could easily drop it, but I do think against some decks, like especially a rush deck, having the access to healing is actually really nice. So being able to just heal 3 damage, yeah, this is really just more of a tech card in this deck, just so that you can have access to heal. Anyway, again, like I said, this is an old deck, but still very strong, and it did get slightly buffed with the introduction of Deepwood Tiger. So I think this is a good time to try out this deck, and it's a very competitive deck. Definitely one I would consider bringing to a tournament, and one I can see doing quite well, especially if you see a lot of ally-based decks. I'll just say, like, when do you want to run this deck? Like, when is a good time? And just in general, when you see a lot of ally-based decks out there, this just like kind of laughs on ally-based decks. And the reason is that Scurvox basically disables all of their allies for a single turn, and that's just really crazy good. Especially in combination with Overwhelm, you can play all your allies, stun them with Scurvox for a turn, and then next turn overwhelm them. And so any kind of ally-based deck, I think, this is very good against. Especially now, you're not seeing as much, you still see them, but you're not seeing as much ability damage decks. And so Scurvox can really thrive in an environment where you're not seeing mages all the time. Another thing that's really benefiting the Scurvox deck right now is the fact that, okay, well, I guess weapon heroes can be a mixed bag. Weapon heroes can be good against this, but one of the nice things is that one of the counters to weapon-based decks is oftentimes just spamming allies. So it can be pretty good against a weapon-based deck, as long as it's not like a very aggressive weapon deck. Okay, anyway, those are my thoughts on this deck. I think it's good in the meta right now, and it's a classic, very strong deck that can counter ally-based decks. So if you're seeing a lot of those, you may want to give this one a shot. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. Let me know what you think of this deck, and thanks for watching.